Welcome to Game Tales, a series about video game storytelling through the use of history, lore, and the stories of not just the game, but the universe it exists in. In the previous episode of The Long Dark, the story of the Quiet Apocalypse, I told the story of the Collapse, a key event in the history of the game. In this video, I will explain the events that would follow the Collapse and bridge the gap between it and the first flare. Like before, if you see this symbol on the bottom left of the screen, it means I will be doing some speculation, as not all information about certain events is clear. Before I continue, I want to remind you to please do the tasks listed on screen. They will greatly benefit the channel, and I will love you beyond measure if you do. Doing them will help this video reach more people and help me know that you enjoyed it. Before I get into today's topic, I need to make an amendment to the previous video. A viewer by the name of Florian had brought to my attention that at one point, one of the survival books had a 2019 edition stamp on it. It was later removed. After doing some research to see if other people have also wondered when the Long Dark takes place, I stumbled upon a forum post that had two estimated years, 2030 and 2022. Now I believe I am incorrect on the timing of the Collapse and the start of Wintermute. This person, called Little Wolf on the Hinterland forum, estimates that based on the birth year of Lily, Greymother's daughter, Greymother would have been born roughly in the 1940s. Depending on the person, Greymother can appear to be any age, but I agree with Little Wolf that she looks to be at least 80 years old. Little Wolf throws out the year 2022 but doesn't really say why they picked 1942 specifically to be Greymother's birth year. I agree though that 2022 makes more sense than 2017 because 10 years before would have been the year the Milton Credit Union shut down. The collapse at its root was a banking crisis. The first thing to go would have been the banks, so the collapse took place in 2012 and the game takes place in 2022. It would also explain the 2019 edition survival book. An important thing to note is that we are definitely not meant to know when the Long Dark takes place. It is supposed to be ambiguous. Even though there are references to drone deliveries and electric cars, Great Bear Island being time-locked with technology from the 80s and 90s kind of proves it. Even though Great Bear Island was already in an economic decline for decades, the collapse was the final straw. The collapse alone wasn't the cause of the island's troubles. Great Bear Island had a history of seismic activities. In the 1960s, seismic activity would play a role in the partial closing of the Carter Dam. I suspect that seismic activity was also responsible for the hydrological changes to the Mystery Lake region. In 2012, the Milton Water Tower and Milton Park for climbing were closed due to, you guessed it, seismic activity. I scoured the internet for a world map of seismic activity, and the islands of northern Canada do have a measurable amount on a regular basis. These seismic events would continuously shape the daily lives of the residents of Great Bear Island, worsening the effects of the collapse. Eventually, the mining industry of Pleasant Valley would collapse due to the earthquakes and the interference of the Forest Talkers. The Forest Talkers is a movement that can't really be pinpointed to a specific period of time. It's very likely they rose as a result of the collapse. After reading their short and mysterious history, I believe they set their sights on Pleasant Valley first. It was relatively untouched by industry, despite the valley's long history with mining. Eventually, whatever the Forest Talkers did would succeed. The movement was headquartered in the hunting lodge in the Broken Railroad region and would target industry specifically owned by mainlanders. After the collapse, a second revival attempt was made to restore Carter Dam. The Forest Talkers had something to say about that. After trapping the dam workers for several days, the activists succeeded in shutting down Carter Dam permanently. Despite their work towards preserving nature, the Forest Talkers were not strangers to violence. Breyer House, the island's logging company, and the owners of the Carter Dam would call them terrorists. It is even known that the Forest Talkers were storing explosives for their illicit activities. As if Great Bear Island didn't have enough problems, the island began to split ideologically and politically. On one side was the anti-mainland side that grew to resent mainland Canada and the perceived occupying forces, the United States of America. The other side was the patriotic side that held on to every lifeline they could get from the mainland and refused to participate in acts they saw as against the mainland. The post-collapse realities would start to take effect over time. Everyone did what they could to survive, but the opposing sides would clash. The anti-mainland group would build their own gardens to feed the locals, similar to the Victory Gardens of World War II era Canada. The patriotic group would do everything in their power to keep supplies flowing, even going as far as dismantling the decaying industry to maintain their communities. World War II era rationing was enacted. Fuel supplies were unstable. A tourist was stranded on the island due to their deep wild flight cancellation, leaving them behind at the time of the first flare. Pharmaceuticals would disappear as supply lines would vanish into thin air. Basic commodities like peaches and coffee would stop being supplied. Supply shipments would stop entirely. Lumber and fishing were the only viable sources of income, as mining had ceased years before. There is nothing I could find about the operation of the food cannery, but my guess would be that it stopped after the collapse. Desperation had settled in. Milton's population collapsed to a few dozen. Those that were smart enough began to prepare for the worst, only they didn't know that the worst would turn out to be the end. Prepper caches would appear, but I believe some of them had been present since before the collapse. A notable series of notes left by Hank, a worker for the forestry watchtower in Mystery Lake, showed that the world itself was getting worse and worse over time. Hank stored extra supplies over time in a notably abandoned and previously existing prepper cache. If it already existed and was completely abandoned, then my guess is that it was an old abandoned Cold War era bunker, but I'm not entirely certain about that. The rise and fall of Great Bear Island is not a light-hearted story. It is truly devastating to read its history knowing that generations of peaceful remote living were destroyed. The people that departed the island left behind what little they had after the collapse, starting over in what is essentially a strange land. As for those that stayed behind, life was not easy before the collapse, and as sure as hell wasn't after. Time took away their livelihoods, prosperity, comfort, and eventually their neighbors. Of the few natives to Great Bear Island met in the game, there is truly a sense of deep sorrow among them. Now, there is another looming darkness, both metaphorically and literally, that is coming. Remember, darkness cannot exist without light, but that is a story for the next episode of Game Tales, The Long Dark, the story of the Quiet Apocalypse. In the next episode, I will discuss the first flare, a solar flare event that sets the events of the Long Dark's campaign into motion. For now, I want to remind you to please do the tasks listed on screen. They will greatly benefit the channel, and I will love you beyond measure if you do. Doing them will help this video reach more people and help me know that you enjoyed it. Alright, I'll be waiting for you in episode 4.